On GB News this week, we heard, neatly expressed, the attitude that could kick off World War III. I invite you to listen again, perhaps, or if not for the first time, to Ian Duncan Smith talking to Nigel Farage.
The problem has been that Ukraine has had to fight this war with two hands tied behind its back. Russia has been able to lob directed missiles at every single part of Ukraine, civilian areas, cities, etc. Ukraine has not been able to return the favour. You can't win a war unless you fight a full war. There's no such thing as a limited war gives you anything at all. So this decision probably should have been taken well over a year to 2 years ago.
I find the language, or really rather the thinking, extraordinary. He says things like, the problem has been that Ukraine has had to fight this war with two hands tied behind its back. You can't win a war unless you fight a full war. And the decision should have been taken a year or 2 years ago. Listen to more of it.
So when you ask me the simple question, can they win the war? It is, of course, feasible for Ukraine to win the war. It's much tougher now for them to do it because of the failure of the West to understand what it takes to win a war.
Well, it takes troops to win a war.
It takes troops, but it also takes weapons.
I mean, given they're running out of men, would you send British troops to Ukraine?
No, I don't believe the whole point about Ukraine right now is by supplying it and giving it the weaponry, you do not run the risk, therefore, having to put boots on the ground. That is the key. If you don't do this, we will be having boots on the ground.
This idea, this repetition of course it's feasible for Ukraine to win the war, and the failure of the West to understand what it takes to win a war, and mention of troops, this dehumanising notion of boots on the ground, as though there were nothing in the boots, far less some mother's sons. Putin started the war, and that it's a message to every single totalitarian state that we're under attack from. I concede it's just possible that Ian Duncan Smith, former leader of the Tory party, had never heard of Ukraine before February 2022, but I doubt it. Judging by what he said this week about the war there, however, a reasonable person, however tenuously hitched to reality, would have cause to wonder. Let's recap on at least some of what we know or should know about what happened long before February 2022, when Russian forces crossed the border into Ukraine.
This is not an attack by Putin on Ukraine in the way that we are told every day. This started in 1990, February 9th, 1990. James Baker III, our Secretary of State, said to Mikhail Gorbachev, NATO will not move 1 inch eastward if you agree to German unification, basically ending World War II.
That was Jeffrey Sachs speaking there. He's an economist, a public policy analyst, perhaps most pertinently between 2001 and 2018. He was special advisor to the UN Secretary General. He's the sort of guy that talks to the White House, that gives advice at the highest levels and gets listened to. It's just my opinion, but I'd say that he makes Ian Duncan Smith sound like he's talking while wearing his butt for a hat. Here's more.
NATO doesn't move, and we agreed to German unification. The U.S. then cheated on this, already starting in 1994, when Clinton signed off on basically a plan to expand NATO all the way to Ukraine. This is when the so-called neocons took power, and Clinton was the first agent of this. And the expansion of NATO started in 1999 with Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic. At that point, Russia didn't much care. There was no border other than with the Königsberg, but other than that, there was no direct threat. Then the U.S. led the bombing of Serbia in 1999. That was bad, by the way, because that was a use of NATO to bomb a European capital, Belgrade, 78 straight days to break the country apart. The Russians didn't like that very much. But Putin became president, they swallowed it, they complained, but even Putin started out pro-European, pro-American, actually. He asked maybe we should join NATO.
So much of what happened in the relatively recent past is almost painful to narrate now because it matters so much to understand it. And yet still, even now, too few people are even invited to pay attention to the facts of the matter. In 2009-10, Viktor Yanukovych was democratically elected president of Ukraine by the people of Ukraine on a platform of promising neutrality for his country. It's also readily available, this information, the sequence of events that utterly gives the lie to the notion Putin invaded out of a clear blue sky, unprovoked. Here's another clip.
February 22nd, 2014, the United States participated actively in the overthrow of Yanukovych. A typical U.S. regime change operation, have no doubt about it. And the Russians did us a favor. They intercepted a really ugly call between Victoria Nuland, my colleague at Columbia University now, between her and the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piat, who's a senior State Department official till today. And they talked about regime change. They said, who's going to be the next government? All of this is to say, the U.S. then said, okay, now NATO's really going to enlarge. And Putin kept saying, stop, you promised no NATO enlargement.
Civil war followed all of that between the west of Ukraine and the east that is home to ethnic Russians. Thousands died and Russia watched. Then there were the peace treaties known as the Minsk Agreements or the Minsk Accords, Minsk I and Minsk II. Negotiations followed by deals supposedly to end the fighting. All of it mediated by France and Germany. Later, then German Chancellor Angela Merkel admitted those peace deals, the Minsk Accords, were insincere and cynical from the point of view of NATO and the West. They were no more, in her words, than an exercise, a deliberate exercise in buying time, a breathing space in which Ukraine could build up its armaments and better prepare for the fighting. Britain was among the NATO powers that from 2014 onwards was training and equipping the Ukrainian armed forces. So there's no escaping the fact that the constant refrain that the war was triggered always and only by Vladimir Putin attacking the Garden of Eden of Western democracy in Ukraine is a lie. The NATO powers, for their own part, did everything they could to provoke the war. As late as December 2021, Putin tabled a draft Russia-United States security agreement seeking guarantees of no further NATO enlargement. Putin's no angel, of course he's not, but there's no gain whatever in accepting the falsehood that he alone was responsible for what happened and what is happening. So, instead of talking to Putin, the US turned down the offer of negotiations. And then, as we know, Putin launched what he called a special military operation into Ukraine. Here's more from Jeffrey Sachs.
And then the United States and Britain said, no way. You guys fight on. We got your back. We don't have your front. You're all going to die. But we got your back as we kept pushing them into the front lines. That's 600,000 deaths now of Ukrainians since Boris Johnson flew to Kyiv to tell them to be brave.
Boris Johnson, former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, made that trip to tell the Ukrainians to turn down the peace deal, to be brave and fight on. That happened all the way back in 2022. 600,000 lives ago. All sorts of Western corporates have, since the get-go, been sniffing around in Ukraine. ExxonMobil, Chevron, Halliburton, smelling Ukrainian oil and gas. Just by the by, for years, Halliburton's CEO was Dick Cheney, who was also George W. Bush's vice president from 2001 to 2009. Cheney was a key architect of the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, the same year Halliburton got a sweetheart deal involving multi-billion-dollar contracts with the US military in that country. But time moves on, and so too the military-industrial complex. Just as a shark drowns if it stops swimming, so the military-industrial complex depends upon constant war for its continued existence. Business is business. Volodymyr Zelensky has already been effusive in his thanks to entities like BlackRock, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and Starlink, promising them big business and big business for others besides. In September last year, Zelensky opened the New York Stock Exchange, saying his country was open for business and hawking $400 billion worth of public-private partnerships, privatisation and private ventures for US companies alone. And here we are now, as Sachs says, 600,000 deaths later. Some analysts say the death toll's closer to 1 million. Who knows? Here we are, 1,000 days into the war, and Ukraine has begun firing US and British-made long-range missiles deep into Russia, with the backing of the Biden administration in the US, as well as just about every British politician that can get its hands on a microphone on national television. For months and years now, military analysts of the calibre of retired US diplomat Chas Freeman Jr. and retired US Colonel and White House advisor Douglas Macgregor have been saying the war is over, long over for Ukraine in every way that matters. Ukraine is presently losing around 2,000 soldiers every day dead. President-elect Donald Trump campaigned, amongst other things, on the claim that he could and would end the war overnight. A few phone calls. And Biden's administration, in its death throes and arguably throwing the mother of all world-ending hissy-fit tantrums, chooses this time to greenlight the use of long-range missiles into Russia. Could it be with the intention of doing the maximum damage in the time that remains to them? Surely not. And while the missiles fly, we have to listen to stuffed shirts in suits, thousands of miles from the front line, insisting Ukraine can still win the war if we just give them bigger missiles to fire. Ian Duncan Smith, now he's just one, he just happens to be the example that I've alighted upon. But Ian Duncan Smith and the likes of Boris Johnson talk glibly as well, if not excitedly, about the prospect of British troops being dispatched into that meat grinder. All of this, all the bellicose talk, the sabre rattling, the spraying of billions upon billions of pounds of British and American taxpayers' money to be laundered through Ukraine is happening while citizens here struggle harder and harder to make ends meet for want of money. Everyone I talk to, people on the street, knows the war is over for Ukraine, knows that all we're getting now is yet more of the same old propaganda, distraction from the financial disaster created by those who hope they can cover their tracks and keep trousering more wealth by whipping up ever more terrifying crises. Cue World War III. And while we shiver and fear for our kids, we have to listen to the politicians whose fault it has been so far make utterly bogus, unsubstantiated claims that Russia plans to move on from Ukraine to invade the rest of Europe. When history shows that while there has been precious little spread from east to west, there's been 1,000 miles of NATO creep from west to east. I say again, encapsulated in what sounds, to me, only like the unhinged ravings of those who, judging by all they say, have no more awareness of recent world history than do last summer's flocks of midges, is the attitude that just might get us all killed. Who could have foreseen that our continued existence might come down to the restraint or not of Vladimir Putin?